Okay, folks, well, I think we'll get started. My name's Julianne Thompson. I'm a hydrologist and a watershed program manager for the Tongass National Forest. I want to welcome you to the EcoAdapt webinar regarding the climate change vulnerability assessment for aquatic resources of the Tongass National Forest. This is an effort that was kicked off by Aaron Uloth and Greg Killinger. And folks may be aware that it's been an item on our Tongass short list of priorities for a few years now, beginning with the aquatic vulnerability assessment. So this report represents a culmination, a pretty important control point in achieving one of these short list priorities for the forest. The report, I think, is going to be a really useful gathering of information in a really rapidly developing field and sets the stage for some next steps for application of the vulnerability assessment, which is what we'll focus on today, and also cooperation with wide range of entities who are moving forward on additional learning and research and adaptations. Just a reminder here, everybody will need to mute their phones for listening pleasure of the group. And getting some background noise right now, so if everybody could make sure that they have their phones on mute. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Laura Hansen of EcoAdapt.
Thanks. Julianne. And thanks to everyone who's joined and is joining us today. Just to second Julianne's request, having you all mute is really helpful. We can externally mute all of you, but that makes it so that it's harder for people to interrupt and ask questions, and we invite you to do so during the course of the webinar. If something requires clarification, you can either interrupt and ask a question, or feel free to enter it in the chat feature on GoToMeeting. And Whitney from the EcoAdapt team will be monitoring those and make sure that we stop to get whatever issue you have covered. So hopefully all of you have now seen the report that came out of the vulnerability assessment process. Some of you I know were involved in that process. Some of you were at the workshops or helped review. But this webinar is intended to sort of give you an orientation to that perhaps dense document, as well as a little bit of guidance on how to use something like this. Not only how it can be used in the Tongass, but how other forest service units are also employing this, as well as people who work outside the Forest Service. So this vulnerability assessment is obviously not all-encompassing of all issues for the Tongass National Forest. It focused on a few specific features in the aquatic resource side of the equation. We'll go into more detail about what those are in a moment. A quick word about who EcoAdapt is. We're a nonprofit that works exclusively on climate change adaptation. So how we change the way we do management, planning, whatever it is that people do to incorporate the reality of climate change into daily decision making so that decisions are durable for long-term success. We do that through 4 programs. The first is the State of Adaptation program. We liken that to finding out how people are fishing, but not just fishing. This is all just part of our metaphor. We use that to figure out what are people doing in the field. What is the state of the science, the state of management? And we do pretty broad scale surveys in this. We've interviewed thousands of people on what they're doing and turned those into case studies, as well as synthesized them into overview reports. The case studies get to live in perpetuity on the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange, which is a free online resource where people who do adaptation can find what other people are doing, or people who are not yet doing it can get examples of what other people are doing. There are a number of tools that are housed in this. We're actually building specific user group content dashboards or modules, and one of the first ones for that will actually be on forest management. So probably something interesting in there for you. Actually, there's 2. The second one is actually on fisheries management. The third program we run is Awareness to Action, which is actually what this process was part of, which is where we help people develop strategies by going through a number of different processes, including vulnerability assessments, as a way to get to building internal capacity and being able to do the work on the ground after the engagement with EcoAdapt is over. And then finally, adaptation consultations are when we do specific work for groups. Sometimes we provide expert advice on a specific topic. We do research. We do all sorts of specific things that add capacity to an organization that doesn't have the capacity to do it. We also run the National Adaptation Forum. The next one will be held in 2015 in St. Louis, Missouri. So for the talk today, we're going to be talking a little bit about the project history and need that led to this vulnerability assessment. We'll talk about the vulnerability assessment itself, as well as the process of what a vulnerability assessment is, because I know that not all of you were involved in this process. We'll talk about the application of a document like this, because the end goal of a vulnerability assessment is not to have a report. It's to have information that you can apply to decision making, and then a little bit on some next step ideas of where things might be going on your side with this. And that's sort of an opportunity as well for you to feedback and talk about how you think you would use this. So why do we need a vulnerability assessment? It's a great question. Not everyone does them, but I like to think about it in terms of the Yogi Berra quote, "The future ain't what it used to be." Most of the management and planning that we have to date is based on how we've historically done things. And a vulnerability assessment gives us the opportunity to see, is what we've been doing actually still going to be effective? For those of you who've just joined us, if you're on and can mute your phone, that's super helpful because it decreases the amount of background noise. Thank you. We operate our models using what we refer to as 5 tenets of adaptation, which we apply to the findings of vulnerability assessments. Those include starting with sort of the spatial way we do planning, which is to protect adequate and appropriate space for a changing world. So that's in an area like the Tongass, looking for where are climate stresses more apparent and where are they less apparent. And one of the things that we'll talk about that was a result of the vulnerability assessment interpretation of the climate information for the region is that there's variability at elevation, and there's variability as to whether you're on an island or on the mainland, if you're at the south end of the Tongass or the north end, and obviously whether you're on north or south-facing valleys. The second is reducing non-climate stressors that are exacerbated by or exacerbate the effects of climate change. This includes things like land use change. It includes things like pollution. It includes things like invasive species, a whole host of the things that already go on in the system even before you incorporate climate change in that equation. The third is to manage for uncertainty. One of the key things about climate change is that not only do you not know what will eventually happen in any given region, but you don't know what will happen along the path there in the fine detail level of what a manager may experience on a day-to-day basis. And as a result, it's really great to come up with plans and thinking that acknowledges that uncertainty exists and that there's a range of potential futures and how you prepare for those. But certainly preparing for the way things were yesterday is probably not a great strategy. The fourth is to reduce the rate and extent of local and regional climate change. This means doing things that can protect local climate types. One of the things that's happening south of where you are is a lot of reintroduction of beavers onto western lands to help maintain water. But there are certainly things that can be done along these lines if you think about snow and ice in the Tongass region. We'll talk more about that later. And fifth is reducing the rate and extent of global change, because the impacts that are being felt in a region like the Tongass in Southeast Alaska are not necessarily being caused by the actions on the ground there or the management on the ground there, but there has to be a reflection on what's happening globally. So all of those responses are part of how you respond to vulnerability. And vulnerability can also allow you, once you acknowledge your vulnerability, you can think about what are the types of adaptation option categories that you want to work in. And those sort of fall into these three kinds of ranges. One is resistance, which is keeping the Tongass exactly as it always was. The second is resilience, which is acknowledging that there is change afoot and figuring out how do the systems that are there now respond to that. And in places that are perhaps a bit more vulnerable than the Tongass is right now in some areas, thinking about how do things have to change dramatically, which leads to response type options. Generally, it's some combination of these types of things that you think about in terms of how do you respond to a vulnerability assessment and figure out what it is you're going to do. Oops. Greg, I'm going to turn this over to you so you can talk a little bit about the specific in the background, the specific background and history that took us from that basic framing of why you need one of these and what kinds of things you think about to what was created here.
Sounds good. So like Laura said, this is Greg Hayward, and she asked me to give a little background and history to help us put this product in context. And I think most of us recognize that an assessment is often the first logical step to addressing potential interests and potential issues. But beyond an assessment being a logical first step, there's national policy that also motivates us to do a climate vulnerability assessment. Several years ago, Dave Cleaves, who's the National Climate Advisor, suggested that each line officer leading a national forest unit should be evaluated regarding their work on climate change. His philosophy was fairly different than other agencies, and that was that the Forest Service should integrate work on climate change into our other work. Other agencies at the time were starting to build structures, including personnel who worked specifically on climate change, and he took a very different and I think a wise approach, and he created the line officer scorecard, which is an evaluation tool for each of the line officers. That includes forest coal for the Tongass, and it lists 10 items that forests should work on in order to integrate climate change into their daily work. And a vulnerability assessment is one of those, and it's a real key one because it helps you understand what's the current situation on the forest relative to climate change and what might the future look like. And that assessment for the line officers, the scorecard, started in 2010. A second major piece of national policy regarding these assessments is that the 2012 rule demands that we consider climate change in our unit planning. So nationally, we have plenty of focus on climate change motivating us to do this sort of work. And now going back to that background slide, the Tongass had been interested in vulnerability assessment long before the national policy came out, and Forest had asked the staff to begin making decisions on where we should focus our thinking on a vulnerability assessment, and that led to a couple stakeholder workshops, the second of which was in April 2012. In the lower right-hand panel here is a cartoon trying to depict the level of interest among a broad group of stakeholders that was brought together. This included the Alaska Native community, the fishing community, environmental organizations, a whole array of stakeholders. And that workshop suggested that topics related to water, snow, ice, salmon were especially important. And so that helped steer some direction regarding where we would put our efforts. At the same time, Tongass leadership realized we couldn't spend a lot of our own staff time on this kind of work. The Chugach had begun a vulnerability assessment that was taking a lot of staff time, and given the many high priority items on the Tongass, that wasn't going to be likely. So the decision was to take a modular approach to climate vulnerability and learning about specific areas one at a time. And this gave us an opportunity to look for partners other agencies interested in particular items and pooling resources. Fortunately, about that same time, EcoAdapt came to us with a true partnership idea. They had funds for working on a vulnerability assessment and experience doing this kind of work with a pragmatic approach to focusing the vulnerability assessment on questions that were important to managers. That was soon after the workshop, and so Aaron Ulof, Greg Killinger, and several of us started working closely with Laura. We were aware that down in Region 5 and with a couple early adopter forests, EcoAdapt was working on this sort of assessment. We were interested in a rapid assessment. Now we can go to the next slide. An assessment that would bite off this one element of vulnerability and inform the forest. I wanted to talk a little bit about a few more details regarding the need for this and the potential uses. I've already talked a bit about the climate scorecard and the planning rule as national motivations, but we also see development of a vulnerability assessment as an important communication tool. It begins a dialogue with our stakeholders, with other agencies, with users of the Tongass. And even if some folks disagree with portions of the assessment or feel that it should have gone a different direction, the document itself begins that dialogue by putting out some information on climate vulnerability and motivating others to think about climate change on the Tongass. So we see this as helping facilitate stakeholder input on projects because it informs folks, especially for things like riparian restoration. It also can help us tap into other partner expertise by displaying our current understanding of vulnerability in this area. It can invite others to say, no, we see it this way, and it helps us tap into that expertise. And finally, I see it as a service to the public and to other agencies because it represents our first overview of potential vulnerability of these important resources. So with that, I'll hand it back over to Laura.
Thanks. So this is just a quick logistical bit about how this process worked. The workshop was 2 days, and it ran through starting by thinking about what is it that folks in the Tongass do, so what are responsibilities, and framing all of the vulnerability questions in terms of starting at that place with an eye toward what does it mean toward the management that gets done at the end of the day. So we explored how does climate change affect the features and species in the region. In this case, we looked at water, ice, and snow as a set of features, and then considered riparian vegetation assemblages and fish as the species of interest. Paired that with what are the management goals and activities that go on around those, and then thought about what is the level of confidence around that kind of change, how will those changes affect the goals and activities that are underway in the region, and then what could be done about it is sort of the end goal, although not the product of this, with the thinking being people don't want to spend 2 days thinking about vulnerability and no time thinking about what could they possibly do about it. So that project group who worked through that workshop were U.S. Forest Service managers and partner organizations. There were partner agencies from around the region. The scope was really just the Tongass National Forest region. It wasn't thinking much more broadly than that, although the Tongass National Forest is already a very large chunk of land. And the vulnerability was specifically focused here just on these aspects of aquatic resources. The goal, as Greg was saying, was to do something rapid, and for this region, rapid also meant that you had to be a little bit more focused. The way the process worked is that prior to the workshop, work was done internally by Forest Service staff in collaboration with EcoAdapt to identify what those priority resources were going to be, what were the areas that there was the most interest and focus on, and Greg showed you that cloud diagram that gives you a sense of how some of that was identified. And then gathering relevant data and information. A lot of this came from groups like SNAP at the University of Alaska, but also partner federal and state agencies, as well as some other entities down in the lower 48 who have some relevant information were put together as sort of the baseline piece. Also gathered at that point were who were the regional experts and players of interest who should be part of the Step 2 workshop. And they were also asked for what information that they had that was relevant that should be pulled together and assessed in advance. Step 2 was actually the 2-day workshop that took participants through a process of looking at each one of those features and assessing the vulnerability based on what people in the room knew, what additional information was presented there, and flagging where was there uncertainty and questions, so that after the workshop, all of that could be synthesized into creating the document that you now all have in your hands or on your screens. Going forward, it'll be thinking about how do we apply these assessment results in your daily work, which again is the point of having you all chatting today. So the way, sort of the checklist of how this goes about happening, because it seems a bit mysterious in how these are done. The first thing is identifying that stakeholder advisory participant group, because you want a group of people who are both vested in using the outcome of the vulnerability assessment and also knowledgeable in the resources and management decisions that are being assessed, so that you can put together what is sort of the state of the science, state of the management knowledge all in one place, and come up with a document and ideally a tool that can be applied. So you want to get all those people together and in the room, especially in this case where we were trying to do this rapidly. That group collaboratively identified focal resources. A bit of that was done on the front end by talking to folks like all of you about what were the areas of interest and previous assessments that had been done. And at the end of the day, that list again is what was selected. That group then collaboratively assesses the resource vulnerability over the course of that 2-day workshop, and then in consultation through a review of the draft vulnerability findings. And finally, there's even some external expert review of vulnerability findings where there were people who couldn't participate in the workshop, but clearly had knowledge that would benefit the final document. So there are some sections that either were inconclusive or conflicting coming out of the workshop that external expert collaboration was required for. But usually it was someone, in this case, it was someone from within the Forest Service who provided that additional guidance. So for those of you who are mathematically inclined, the vulnerability assessment takes into account a number of things, and I'll go into the details of what each one of these things means in a moment. But really, exposure and sensitivity, which define the potential impact, coupled with the adaptive capacity of the resource or action that you want to take, lead to creating what the vulnerability is, or understanding what the vulnerability is. And there's also an equation version, if you like that sort of thing. So the goal of all of this is to assess the vulnerability of selected resources to climate and non-climatic stressors using literature review, spatial climate information where it's available, and expert input. All of that is put together in that workshop and in the subsequent document creation. So the first of those is sensitivity, which is the measure of whether and how a species or habitat or feature is likely to be affected by a given change in climate. The kinds of factors that affect sensitivity for a habitat or species or feature can be climate, they can be disturbance regimes, they can be non-climate stressors, they can be dependencies, they can be life history aspects. All of those things determine whether or not something is sensitive to climate change. The second factor we talk about is assessing exposure, which is the measure of how much change in climate or other environmental factor a resource is likely to experience. And some of the highlights for the Tongass region, and these maps are all in your document where they will probably be much easier to read, include things like mean annual temperature, and the projection for 2050 is an increase. Precipitation, again for 2050, it's a generalized increase. And then day of freeze and day of thaw, they're shifting over time. For many of these factors in the document itself, you will actually find maps for different locations across the Tongass because there is so much variability. So for example, at the bottom, you see one of the figures created by SNAP for precipitation, monthly average precipitation for Sitka over the next century. There are also maps for other locations in the Tongass that show very similar patterns, but sometimes different actual values because obviously precipitation amounts throughout the region vary. Adaptive capacity is the ability to accommodate or cope with climate change impacts with minimal disruption. This is sometimes the harder one to get one's mind around, but it's really just how much change can you take before it actually starts to affect you. And factors that affect adaptive capacity of habitats or species include things like the extent of the species, the status of the species, is it endangered or threatened, and the dispersal ability. Dispersal barriers and landscape permeability can affect how well you can adapt. If you can't get to the upstream habitat or you can't get over the next ridge, that can decrease your ability to respond to change. How plastic or static your life history and habitat diversity are, and then finally from the perspective of all of your jobs, what is the management potential? Is there much that can be done either because of limitations to the natural system or because of what your mandate is or what regulatory limits are? So at a vulnerability workshop, there's a lot of small groups talking together, and there are worksheets that get filled out that guide people through the process and ask the kinds of questions that can help identify vulnerability. This is a species sensitivity worksheet from a workshop, and participants take notes on these on computers, and they all get collected for synthesis into a final product. So some of the specific findings from this that are in this vulnerability assessment, I'll start with the snow, ice, and water component. Overall, the sensitivity to climate and climate-driven changes for those features is moderate high to high, which is not surprising. This is due to increased temperatures at all elevations, altered precipitation from snow to rain, particularly at low elevation. Again, that's one of those variabilities across the region. Reduced snowpack, particularly at low elevations and on islands, and earlier ice and snow melt time and later autumn onset time of ice and snow. The sensitivities to non-climate stressors were seen as low. This is actually a really big benefit for the Tongass region compared to most of the other regions where people are grappling with climate change. For snow, timber harvest was probably one of the factors that could be affecting the sensitivity of that feature. For water, it was dams and water diversion, obviously. For ice, it was black carbon and windblown particulate, isostatic rebound, and tectonic events. So not a long list for any of these things. And in some cases, even those non-climate stressors are not terribly human controllable, such as things like tectonic events, for example. For riparian vegetation, the sensitivities included increased temperature, were seen as moderate to high, sorry, and they included, again, increased temperature, altered hydrology, high and low flows, both changes in both ends of that, and related soil moisture. CO2 levels and nutrient availability affect the sensitivity of riparian vegetation, and disturbance regimes, especially things like wind throw and avalanche, came out high on the list of things that can affect riparian vegetation and their vulnerability to climate change. From a non-climate perspective, these were actually, for riparian systems, it was actually pretty high because timber harvest affects riparian vegetation. Transportation corridors often cross or run along riparian systems, and insects and stem decay were seen as a problem. And finally, for fish species, the big sensitivities were really seen as moderate from climate and climate-driven changes. But again, a lot of heterogeneity across the system and between freshwater and marine components of the system. So increased year-round stream temperatures will likely affect fish. Altered flow regimes, again, both high and low flow, depending on timing, especially in life history stages. And changes in the marine environment, including temperature, salinity, pH, upwelling, and all the related things that happen from those in food availability, as well as fisheries practices leading to changes in food availability. On the non-climate stressor side, there was high to moderate sensitivity for fish based on timber harvest and other land use conversions, hydropower development, hatcheries and aquaculture, as well as fishing, mining, and invasive species. All of those things contribute to the vulnerability of fish species in the region, and it's really important in all of these cases to think about how are these climate sensitivities and these non-climate sensitivities interacting with each other, because those are a lot of the points at which there is a higher likelihood of management opportunity. So in the vulnerability assessment, it goes on to also elucidate what are the aspects of not only sensitivity, but how are adaptive capacity affected in each one of those, and how is exposure affected in each one of those, although the exposure and the sensitivity are often tightly coupled. The products that are available for all of you to use to work your way through this document there's a workshop support page for those of you who attended the workshop. You've already seen this. If you have not, if you look down at the bottom of this slide, there is a URL for getting to that. It has all the presentations from that meeting, as well as some of the synopses, and obviously has a copy of this vulnerability assessment report as well. And then finally, some of the specific resource findings are in the appendices of this document, but then also on the workshop support page. Jesse, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about the application side.
Great, thank you, Laura. So hi, everybody. This is Jesse Kirshner. I'm a lead scientist at EcoAdapt. So I'm going to be talking about how you can think about applying this type of vulnerability information in different management operation levels. And I'm also going to be providing some different examples of using vulnerability information to develop adaptation strategies and actions. So vulnerability information can be applied within a number of different management operation levels, and I've listed several here. The first is within planning documents. So this is sort of this higher level forest plan, forest assessment level, where vulnerability information can be incorporated. And if you look down at the bottom, I have an example of a desired condition that was included in a draft proposed action that's now out for review from one of the early adopter forests. So what you can see is they have, for their desired condition, that stream ecosystems, riparian corridors, and associated stream courses are functioning properly and are resilient to natural disturbances such as flooding and climate change. And it goes on from there. So recognizing that natural disturbances and climate change are needing to be incorporated into desired conditions is a great place to kind of get this climate type of information incorporated into forest planning and forest assessment. Vulnerability information can also be incorporated into resource management strategies. So this is sort of at that mid-level or program level planning. So this includes things like fire or travel management plans, conservation strategies. It could be landscape or watershed assessments. Those are all places where vulnerability information can get incorporated. Vulnerability information can also be used within monitoring plans. So when you go through a vulnerability assessment process like we did for the Tongass, inevitably what comes out are where we have data and information gaps. So where is it that we need to think about implementing more targeted monitoring in order to gather that information and move forward with whatever management actions we need to take. So this vulnerability assessment can really be used to hone in on where those data and information gaps can be and what we might want to think about for targeted monitoring. And then lastly, it can be used in project design and implementation, so more at the project or site-specific level, whether it's in design features or actual prescriptions. And the reason I bring up these three different sort of management operation levels, this plan level, program level, and project level, is that I want to provide a couple of examples of adaptation actions and where they fit within these three different operation levels within the Forest Service. Next slide. So the first example that I wanted to present is around winter recreation and what some of the potential vulnerabilities that came out of this vulnerability assessment process were for winter recreation. So this included decreased snowpack, shifts from snow to rain, and earlier snow melt. Go ahead and click, Lara, for the adaptation. So when we think about what kinds of actions we might want to implement in order to deal with these potential vulnerabilities, what I've done is compile a list of adaptation actions that either were generated as part of the vulnerability assessment workshop that we led or were from the peer-reviewed literature, so that was incorporated after we did the vulnerability assessment write-up. And then some of these actions are even from some of the other experts we're engaged in. So I think Lara and Greg both mentioned that we've been involved with other forest planning efforts in California, Idaho, and Montana. So what I've done is pull some of the actions that those groups have developed that I thought might be relevant here and just give some good food for thought for folks. So for winter recreation, our general adaptation strategy might be that we want to prepare for decreased snowpack and changing winter recreation opportunities. And we can do this through a number of different actions. One of them may be through encouraging ski area modifications. So within our report, one of our contributors noted that the Eagle Crest ski area, which is in Juneau, built a mid-mountain chairlift in order to access snow at higher elevations, which allows that ski area to open even when snow is absent from lower parts of the mountain. So that represents a really nice adaptation action to potential decreases in snowpack in the future. We could also consider making more snow for downhill areas. For those downhill ski businesses, they might want to think about diversifying their business model, so expanding winter recreation business to now include summer business. I know in the lower 48, what they've done in a lot of ski areas is trying to attract mountain bikers and to come to areas they use the ski lift to take people up the hill and then do mountain bike trails down. In terms of forest management operations program level, we could think about implementing a safety education program for increased risk. So this might be due to increased risk of avalanches or to thinning ice. And then at the more project or site-specific level, we might want to think about educating visitors about changing snow and winter recreation opportunities. So as Lara mentioned, there's a lot of spatial variability about where climate impacts and vulnerabilities are going to occur. So we're really going to want to do this education at more of the site-specific levels. So where those vulnerabilities are going to occur, we may want to have signs out there educating users about what new opportunities for recreation might be, or things that they need to be careful of in terms of safety. Next slide. So another example, again, centered on recreation, is around rafting. And I highlighted both glacial and non-glacial streams for potential vulnerabilities. So what you can see is there's quite a bit of overlap. So what you see is that both glacial and non-glacial streams are at increased vulnerability from runoff and flood magnitudes. Glacial streams are likely to have increased stream flow in all seasons, whereas non-glacial streams may have higher winter flows but lower summer flows. Next. So for our adaptation strategy, what we may want to think about doing is employing more management flexibility in order to accommodate for these changing conditions. And some of the actions that we might want to think about implementing could be at a program level, varying the permit season in order to adapt to changes in peak flow and duration. At the program or project level, we could think about extending the use seasons to accommodate changing timeframes of peak flows. And also at this more project level, we're going to want to think about coordinating with some of the surrounding businesses or folks that provide lodging opportunities, so that if we are opening areas or extending use seasons, that there are places for people to stay and amenities for them to use. And we have this as a project level, again, because these areas are going to vary. The vulnerabilities of these areas are really going to vary spatially within the Tongass National Forest. So those use seasons may extend in some places and not in others. We can also think about improving communication tools for forest visitors in order to alert them to changing conditions. And this could be things like if there's flooding that's happening, landslides, things like that. And then lastly, we could educate water recreation providers and users. So just to what the changes might be and how they can take advantage of where there might be opportunities and where there might be risks. Next slide. And so the last adaptation action example that I want to focus on is around riparian restoration. And so some of the potential climate vulnerabilities are increased rain on snow events, which affect the frequency and magnitude of high flows and runoff. There's an increased likelihood of landslides and erosion, and increased wind speed, which is a really unique issue here for the Tongass National Forest. Next. So the adaptation strategy that we might want to think about here for dealing with these potential vulnerabilities is focused design of harvest, so timber harvest and road activities, to moderate the effects of climate change on riparian vegetation and restoration. So some of the more specific actions that we could think about at a program level is to continue to use or increase stream buffer regulation for timber harvest. So there's already some great best management practices and things in place that we want to continue to use and implement that will help deal with some of these potential vulnerabilities. We could also think about using modeling data to identify the elevation bands within the region that may be more susceptible to rain on snow events. And then within those areas that may be more susceptible, that may be places where we want to target limiting some of these management activities in terms of timber harvest or road activities. Or if there are roads or things already occurring in those areas, maybe those are places we really want to target for decommissioning or removal. At the project level, we might want to think about focusing our harvest activities in wind-exposed landscapes. So if we're likely to have increased wind speed, we might want to be targeting those areas that are already wind-prone if they're going to be getting worse. And we know we need to do some harvest. That might be an ideal place to think about doing those particular harvest activities since they're going to experience windrow anyways. Next slide. So those examples that I presented, as I mentioned, they came out of the vulnerability assessment process that we undertook. And now what I wanted to do is provide an example of how you incorporate this kind of climate information in an existing plan using this greater sage-grouse example. So I thought it might be useful to just give folks a context of the kinds of language that you can think about incorporating into an EIS around climate change. So this particular example, again, is for Idaho and southwestern Montana greater sage-grouse. And the question was, how are the BLM and Forest Service going to address the potential expansion of non-native annual grasses and associated loss of sagebrush habitats as a result of climate change? Next slide. So within this plan, they did a couple of really cool things. The first is these overarching guidelines. So what you can see is first they recognize that the local climate patterns of historic record for plant growth may change due to these warmer and drier conditions, and that change is likely to occur over the life of the plan. So just within that guideline, they've already acknowledged that what they've seen in the past is likely to be different than what they're going to see in the future, even within the next 10 to 15 years. And they also acknowledge that as the tools for predicting climate changes in the management area improve, and climate change affects resources more than it already is and necessitates changes in how resources are managed, these agencies may be required to reevaluate their decisions and then to adjust management accordingly. So what they've done here is really designed management flexibility into their plan, into their EIS in order to accommodate changing futures. So this flexibility is going to be really important because it gives them the ability to deal with what may come. Next slide. The other example that I wanted to point out within this existing plan is around one of their alternatives. So this alternative is around their priority management areas with highest conservation value to maintain or increase. So basically, these are priority areas that they want to target for sagebrush habitat restoration. And so what they want to do within these areas is to reestablish sagebrush cover and desirable understory plants. So these are really the highest priority areas for restoration. And they want to do this restoration with native seeds. But what they recognize is that when they're collecting native seeds, they need to consider climate change in two ways. First, they need to consider the long-term availability of native seed. And this came out because in this particular region, increased fire frequency and severity is really an issue. And so if you have some of these native seeds that you're really going to need to get, you're going to want to go and get those at areas that may be at higher risk, higher fire-prone areas, because those plants may no longer be there. So that needs to be a key consideration in that native seed collection, are these fire-prone areas that may not be there if we don't get there soon enough. And then the second piece is around the resilience of the native seed itself. So are there particular species of plants that are going to be more resilient to climate, and are those places that we also want to think about targeting for this native seed collection? So what you can see in the proposed modification of the management action, they want to establish native seed harvest areas that incorporate climate change effects. So in this case, it's particularly around fire. And then also they want to consider climate change when determining species for restoration. So again, this is around what species are going to be suitable now that are likely to be suitable as well in the future. So they're thinking and planning ahead. So this, I think, just represents a really good example of how you could think about climate impacts and how they can be incorporated into an EIS or sort of more project level kinds of issues that come up. Next slide.
Do you want me to take it back, Jessie?
Oh, yeah, go for it. Sure.
No, if you're on a roll, go for it.
No, it's fine.
Okay.
I think you're...
All right. So the examples that Jessie just gave you are sort of at the end of the cooking show. This is sort of what the ideas were that people have already implemented and sort of skipped a few steps. In Appendix A at the back of the vulnerability assessment is a lot of the ideas that Jessie just shared, as well as the two flowcharts that I'm about to show you. And these flowcharts are completely not all-inclusive of everything, but they're a way to start getting you to think about where would you apply the vulnerability assessment and how would you use it to improve your work at the programmatic and the project level. So you start with pretty basic questions like, does the program you're working on take climate change into account? And you answer it along a dichotomous tree of yes or no. If you think that it does, then it's probably still worth going back and looking at the vulnerability assessment to make sure that you're doing it sufficiently. Are you really thinking about all of the different parameters that might be affecting it? Are there some that you should reevaluate for? If you never took it into account, then you should definitely be asking yourself, could climate change compromise the program's efficacy? And you can use the vulnerability assessment to evaluate that, especially if your answer to that question is, I don't know. Definitely worth going back and looking at the vulnerability assessment findings and mapping out where you think the implications of climate might be. If you don't think it is, if you think that climate change won't compromise its efficacy, make sure that you're thinking about those interactive effects that I flagged earlier, those interactions between different parameters of climate change as well as between climactic and non-climactic stressors. Because frequently those are the kinds of interactions are where we miss what some of the greater vulnerabilities that are going to emerge come from. If you think that climate change could affect the efficacy, then you think about, are there ways that we can improve the program to reduce that vulnerability? And again, you can use that vulnerability assessment to get a greater clarity on what those are to try and brainstorm what ideas you have for how you could make the program less vulnerable. The useful or unfortunate aspect of this kind of flow diagram is that when you get to that bottom right-hand corner, you really have to go back and start over at the beginning because there'll be more information that's available and conditions will have been changed since you made your initial analysis. But at least what you're doing at that point is sort of the state of management and the state of the science. We give you one specific water resource project level planning flowchart as well that can focus on whatever aspect of it is that you're doing. It's really just some general framing so that you're asking those questions and maybe asking them twice. And another piece of this, when you're working on water resources, for example, one of the tools that Jesse put out there for how people apply the learning from a vulnerability assessment to riparian area protection is working with upslope or exterior from the riparian zone management partners. So what are other people doing, and how might what they're doing to respond to changing conditions be beneficial for riparian zones or cause more problem for riparian zones? So how do you get people planning together? So making sure that in your role in the Tongass Forest, you're talking to your cross-jurisdictional boundary or biomic partners in management so that you're making plans that benefit each other is going to be really important. And obviously when thinking about riparian or fisheries or anything else, thinking about how the physical conditions are changing as well. So not just using this document to say, what does it mean for riparian systems, but read the section about what it means for water and snow and ice, because that has big implications for riparian systems. And as a riparian manager, there may be things missing from this report that you realize are emerging. So those tools are all in Appendix A for you to use. We want to acknowledge the funders of this project, who were both the Forest Service and the Wilberforce Foundation. We want to thank all of the partners who were part of this. That's all of the participants in the workshops and all the reviewers. And we particularly want to remind everyone that this project is dedicated to the memory of Greg Killinger, who really helped make this project happen. And a lot of the in-depth aspects of analysis, especially in the fisheries side of things in this report, would not have happened were it not for Greg's attention to detail and concern about the Tongass. So thank you all for listening. I want to let everyone know that we recorded the session. We'll make a recording of it available. We'll post it to the workshop support page so that you can listen to it or share it with other people later. But if anyone has any questions or wants to discuss ideas about how they plan to use a document like this, or questions they have about how they could, the floor is yours.
And Laura, this is Greg, and I don't want to stop any questions, but I wanted to build on the acknowledgement of Greg Killinger and note to all of you that after we lost Greg, Julianne Thompson, Patty Crossy, and Sheila Jacobson really stepped up and helped fill in a bunch of what Greg was doing, and I wanted to make sure I acknowledged them. And more along the technical lines, I wanted to note as we start out questions that when we use the word vulnerability, we didn't emphasize it, but I should have noted it in the portion I presented, that we're not only looking for negative changes. There's changes that are taking place that society, that helps build positive change related to society's interests. So vulnerability is kind of a misnomer, but we're looking at change in general and how does it influence the resources we're managing. So let's open it up for questions.
Absolutely. Someone typed in and asked if the PowerPoint will be available. The PowerPoint will be viewable in the recorded webinar, but we'll also post that on the workshop support page just as a PDF so you can flip through it at your leisure.
And I'll just let folks know we're going to link to the workshop web page from our Watershed SharePoint site. So if folks are in the need of roaming around and finding that again later, we'll be able to make that available pretty easily from our internal SharePoint sites.
Laura, did you want to talk about next steps at all?
Oh, actually, I leave that in the hands of Greg and Julianne.
And I think I'd first like to open it to the large audience just for questions.
And Michelle, you typed in a question about the Climate Savvy Decision Support slide. Do you want to ask something about that?
Yeah, this is Michelle Parker, and I'm part of the Forest Service Nationwide Sustainable Operations Collective, and we're going to be doing an employee survey, and I really liked that slide to ask yourself if you are, including climate change in your daily workflow. I think the slide before it, the generic one, I thought that was really could affect all employees. I thought that was great.
Well, it is yours for the using.
So how soon do you think the PowerPoint will be available?
As soon as I'm not using my computer screen to show the slide, and we're off the call, I will post it on that workshop support page. There'll be a PDF of the whole presentation there.
Okay,
the
great.
recorded version takes a little bit because it has to download and decompress.
Right. Thank you.
This is Tricia. Can I ask a question just this way? Does this work?
Yeah.
I don't know if we were supposed to type them in or not. So one of the things that strikes me, and this may be getting sort of into some of the next steps that we need to do internally, but that when you go through this sort of decision support process, scale is such a big factor. And I think even going back to the vulnerability question, depending on what the scope and scale of what you're talking about, there are some things that probably are still in the realm of relatively low. They come out as moderate to high, sort of if you look at the big picture, but on a case by case, they might not be. So I'm just curious how the scale, especially on our forest that's so big and so, how do we sort of weave that into this? And so, I guess my thought is you don't want every time someone's doing a project, they really shouldn't have to ask this question because in theory we've thought about it at a bigger scale and taken it into account at that. So I'm just not sure how that gets into play in this whole thing.
Yeah. So certainly people who are working in the Forest Service as managers who have thought about this and implemented it in anything, please chime in. But in general, my goal of when I'm done with my job and can retire is when really people are just asking this kind of question is just inherent in how you think about things, just as you think about everything else. Scale is a huge issue, but I don't think it can be taken on just at the large scale for the Tongass because of all that variability and because of the variability in how things are implemented, because there are decisions that you make on a fine scale that can be much less or much more vulnerable just based on how they're implemented and whether there's thought about what does climate mean for this. So if you're doing a restoration project, for example, thinking about where you are across the range of the Tongass, what species you're using, if you're doing replantings or if you're doing grading or if you're doing stream bed restoration, the kinds of materials you use may vary across that range over time, not just because they normally already vary across the range, but because things are moving at different rates in different places. So the local decision you make in one site might be very different than in another site because it's a more sensitive site. It's a place where there'll be more flooding than another location. So I think it actually is, you have to, for each thing you really have to start with what is your goal, and what is the time frame of your goal, and how will change over time be affecting it. So I would urge that I think even though there's sort of the higher level, we're trying to make the entire Forest Service unit as resilient as possible, there's still the small scale variability that's going to have to be taken into effect to get good management outcomes. Did that make sense, or did I further muddy the waters for you?
No, it makes sense. I think, sort of where my mind is going from is that, especially on a forest that is relatively intact for most of our landscape, it's kind of an interesting question about how to scale, as opposed to most national forests, which are the complete opposite. You know, where,
right,
you know, so I think it's, yeah. But I think your point is well taken about the whole point of, I really like that idea of getting people to just start thinking about this. Makes sense to me. So I think that's good.
Yeah, and then there is at some point sort of the larger vision for the Tongass. Is the larger vision for the Tongass because you do have that benefit of having had less change on the system already because of anthropogenic influence? Is there a decision that Tongass management is all about seeing what happens to the system as climate changes, with the understanding that you're actually, in some aspects of the Tongass, not having as much change as other places? Or is it the Tongass has some really important resources, these resources have to be protected as they are, and those two different philosophies would lead to two different management strategies, both at the high level and at the local level. But they're philosophically different.
Tricia, this is Greg, and I think your question about scale is an important one, and it uncovers some frustration that many people are likely to have with the assessment, because given that it's an assessment that necessarily had to think about the Tongass broadly, it's not going to speak well to individual locations in any incisive way, but it sets up a framework for thinking about it. So during the development of it, there were a lot of people expressing frustration, and rightly so, that we weren't adequately describing the variation in different factors across the forest. And I think that's necessitated by the scale that this is written at. But I'm glad you brought up the scaling piece, and I think that that's something we need to communicate well, is that this provides a look at a broad scale, and it provides a way to ask the questions, but as you start to look more finely, you still have to pose those questions again, and the answers might be different.
And Julianne, you had a comment that you typed in. Do you want to
elucidate
that?
I would just follow on there. That is something that a lot of us have struggled with a bit. The complexity of interactions and multiple directions of many of these things is sort of mind-boggling at times. And we've noticed, you know, there's a lot of climate change reports that sort of synthesize what happens in the Pacific Northwest and or what happens in Alaska, and we find that Southeast Alaska is sort of on the shoulder of both of those sometimes, and there's a lot of things happening, you know, in our specific area that don't really match the broader conclusions from the Pacific Northwest or the main part of Alaska. But what I really think is the value of this report as an initial step is that it will help us move forward on both existing tools and some tools that we could develop that will be useful to stratify and hone this assessment at different scales. And an example of that is that we already have some good peer-reviewed research based on the body of literature on timber harvest effects on stream flow that would indicate that we can stratify our watersheds based on their sensitivity to changes, shifts between snow to rain with these warming temperatures, which then makes them more or less resilient to effects of timber harvest on stream flow, and by virtue of affecting the snowpack. As that snowpack diminishes, you know, there may be a stronger effect. So we do have these tools already in some cases, and there may be others that we need to continue to develop. For example, if we can get better quality DEMs for the forest, it will really help in a lot of elevational models that could be used at project scale for honing the climate change effects analysis.
Any other questions? Okay, Greg or Julianne, do you want to chat about internal next steps on what you all are up to?
And I'm being quiet for a second because I think Julianne's usually better at that kind of thing.
Oh yeah, thanks, Greg. so the main thing that still needs to be said too is that you know, if it were not for Greg Hayward, I don't think we would have been at this point even yet. Greg really picked up the pieces at a difficult time for all of us to keep this project moving forward. So he deserves a lot of credit for getting us to where we are today, and I really appreciate the flexibility and diligence of EcoAdapt in bringing us to this point as well. You know, I think we do need to have some internal discussions about next steps. We have a new staff officer. We have a forest plan amendment that's in the works that no doubt is very narrowly focused, so our ability to incorporate some of this stuff is pretty limited. But nonetheless, it came up a lot in public comment, and I think some of those discussions need to take place as well. I'm looking for guidance on how we can be very strategic in our next steps. We have limited resources in terms of personnel and funding, and yet we know there's so much going on in the region with partners, universities, research, et cetera. It really behooves us to stay in touch in that dialogue and move forward and benefit from those efforts. So I don't know that I know specific next steps, but I think getting to this point will really help us pursue that kind of strategic dialogue in the region and at the forest level too.
And one of the next steps I see with this particular product is that I hope people will treat it as a loose leaf sort of product, use it, beat it up, provide other staff members with ideas regarding what you see that can be built on, what you see in there that you might disagree with. Use it as a way to stimulate thinking and dialogue. And I think, secondly, we can use it as an example of a process. We particularly were looking for a process that didn't take a lot of Tongass staff time, that used expertise in the region and got things done rapidly. And some people looking at this might think it didn't happen rapidly, but we probably, you know, we're set back about 4 months because of some events that took place, and so this can be done rapidly. I think that all of those involved wish that we could have maybe been a little more rigorous with a little bit more time, and so we should think about that and how it works into future processes. So I think this second message I'm trying to give is for us to step back 2 steps, look at this as a model for an approach to build an assessment, and ask ourselves, when the Tongass decides the next module that it would like to address in a vulnerability assessment, how should we go about it, and what does this approach that we took here tell us about what might be effective and what might not?
And this is Laura again. I'd like to encourage everyone, when you're using this and thinking about this, and if you find things about it that aren't getting you to all the information that you want, we've done this kind of process, and other Forest Service units have done this. Greg's involved in one with the Chugach, for example. So there are other vulnerability assessments out there for other forests, some of them not in your region. It's worth giving those a look just to see what are the kinds of things that they're evaluating, And then many of those Forest Service units have also done the next step of developing adaptation plans that are related to the vulnerability assessment. And those might give you a better feel of more of the kinds of examples that Jesse presented and the outcomes of these kinds of decision support trees, so that you get a flavor for what does the application of this look like if in fact you're sort of struggling with what do I do with this kind of information, because it seems like a lot.
And I think it's tough on a call like this to kick around ideas, but I think your point there regarding, okay, what are the next steps in terms of applying this? What does it lead you towards in terms of adaptation actions? What does it lead you towards just in terms of considerations for projects and so forth? I think part of that has to come through becoming more familiar with the document, and then making sure that as staff people, we ask that question each time that we're starting a project or other management business items. What does this product say about the endeavor that we're stepping into? And I think in a lot of cases, what it can tell us about is setting priorities. Where are the best places to put money and where are not good places because of the way the future is going to look as a consequence of climate change.
So I think that's an invitation to anyone who's on the call who's thinking, wow, I've got this particularly vexing thing that I can't figure out how climate would be relevant to, or I can't figure out what I would do about this challenge. That if you want to throw it out there, you've got a whole call full of people who are thinking about this with you that you could take advantage of.
Okay, well, not seeing or hearing other questions. I guess we can wrap this up. I really appreciate EcoAdapt's webinar presentation. It was helpful, and actually helped me sort of iron out some things in my brain about moving forward. So I do appreciate it.
Great.
And thanks all to folks who called in.
And this is Tricia, and I'd like to echo that, Julianne. For me, this was really a really good summary of what we did and why and where we're at. And I think it helped me think about next as well. So I think I really appreciate all the work everybody's done. This is really good work.